Mark, man, how are you? Thanks for the time.
Hey, what's going on, guys? How are you doing? Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
No, man, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here today on the Scores Company. Mark, I find I've been following you on social media for quite some time, and I found what you did very, very interesting because we've actually got a listener named Mark who is a truck driver who's currently traveling the country, and he's stopping at college campuses all along the way. And whenever I'm out of town, if there's a college football stadium around, I try and stop and go see it. And I think there's a lot of our listening audience who does the same. And I'm always talking at some point in my life, I'd like to get to the point where I can travel to different parts of the country to see some games. In 2021, you did that. Tell us about how this journey got started.
Yeah, I did. And I think you're right. I think it's shared by a lot of college football people. It's kind of our religion in certain ways. So we want to get out and go visit the various cathedrals we have around the country and see what it's all about in the different regions. So that's kind of where my journey began. I love college football. I wanted to write a book about college football. And I'd always absorbed the game regionally as you need to, but with a national perspective. I loved how the game was different in different parts of the country. I loved the flavor of the cultures out west, down south, northeast, midwest, how the different conferences reflected that, and how the game itself, that built organically. That comes from the land, it comes from the people, it comes from how we live in these various places. So when I tied in college football with that in the book I wanted to write, that's why I set out on the journey. I wanted to experience it for myself.
You did just that, but these things take time. You don't just do this on a whim, wake up one day and say, you know what, next week I'm going to do this journey. I'm sure there's a lot of planning. So how did you plan for these trips?
Yeah, there was. Maybe it was the only kind of positive thing going on around my life during the COVID period. It was something to focus on externally that gave me something to do when it was all over. I don't want to say the only positive, but I mean it was a return to normalcy, getting back to stadiums, getting around big crowds, getting college football back to normal. So I took the COVID year when we didn't play with fans, planned the book, planned the travel, planned the sort of thesis I was going to go after in writing the book, and really just spent all that time and then that off season after the 2020 season getting ready to do it. So you're absolutely right. It was a long planning process, but fortunately at that period I had the time to do it.
This was a journey that literally stretched from coast to coast. How did what places were you able to hit along the way?
Yeah, so the games I picked, I wanted to pick representative rivalries or historic programs or particularly historic stadiums. So the sampler, it ends up kind of rolling out like a college football fan's, dream journey. The Rose Bowl. I went up to Fayetteville for Texas, Arkansas. I went to Memorial Stadium to watch Nebraska, Oklahoma. Bryant-Denny Stadium, Red River at the Cotton Bowl. I got to a game at LSU Tiger Stadium, which is one I'd wanted to visit for a long time. Notre Dame Stadium, Doak Campbell Stadium, Husky Stadium, the Yale Bowl for Harvard-Yale, and then Michigan Stadium for Ohio State-Michigan, and a few others in there. I actually went to another game in 2022. I went down to Neyland Stadium for Alabama-Tennessee, so I got Neyland in there too. So it was really some of the best the sport has to offer.
You picked a hell of a game to go to in 22, my friend.
That was amazing. Let me tell you something. On this Odyssey, I got a lot of good games. I had 4 field stormings. I had a neutral site field storming, and I had 1 visitor field storming. And but I would say the one in Knoxville at Tennessee was the wildest field storming I've ever seen in my life.
We should use you as the barometer for games of the week, maybe not College Game Day.
Hey, you want to call me up and ask? I've had some pretty good luck, kind of like a salty fisherman who knows the holes.
I appreciate that. What you got for Mark there, Ian?
Yeah, I was scrolling your Twitter, Mark, and I saw a post that you made saying the 90s era of college football is what you kind of consider to be the peak era of college football. As somewhat of a college historian, how do you think this current era of college football will be remembered with the portal, the NIL, and all the realignment and things of that nature?
Yeah, it's a revolutionary moment. Part of the reason I set out to do this book when I did is, as I told many people, was I think college football is going down its old roads for a final time. I think we're seeing the end of about 150-plus year era of college football that's going to kind of be cut off from its past in certain ways when we're talking about the explicit professionalization, the money-making, the transfer portal. I think we're going to get revenue sharing and player contracts at some point, and I don't want to speak negatively about what's coming because most of it I think is actually good, and I think college football has to do it if it's going to have another 150 years. But I think we're in a revolutionary period, so I think we're going to see this era as the transition to the next epoch of college football. So there's going to be a pretty good separation when you're talking about between the two, totally different from the 90s.
Mark, outside of going to the Poinsettia Bowl in San Diego years ago, which was obviously a bowl game, I've yet to experience a college football game outside the South, which obviously I've been to a bunch of different places, but it has been in this region. How is the attitude towards the game, and I guess how is it different by region?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's kind of a tough question. When you're at the stadium and tailgating and going to the games, there's not much difference other than the kind of cuisine you get served, the spices they use, and some of the ways they cook them. But when you're talking about the larger regions, it's very different because some areas are dominated by professional sports. Other areas are much more interested in college athletics. And one of the things I love about the South, I grew up in the Midwest. I went to school in the West. One of my connections with the South in this country has always been college athletics. There's a deep love for college sports, and of course it came from the late arrival of professional sports in the South and the preeminence of the college games down there and how much it meant to the local population to have their college teams both win at home and then go out into the country and compete with teams from other regions and test themselves that way. So, it's like I said, once you're at the stadium, college football is college football, but the regions themselves are quite different.
Was there a place that you were expecting to be great that was maybe disappointing and maybe one you didn't have the highest of expectations? Maybe it kind of blew you away.
Yeah, it's tough to, I grew up in the TV era, so one of the things I really dealt with on the journey was kind of the surreal nature at showing up at these places and feeling like I'd been there 100 times. So I dealt with that more than like any real disappointment or being blown away. I will say this. I went to the Harvard-Yale game out in the Northeast because the Ivy Leagues invented college football. They didn't just invent it. They wrote all the rules. And every beautiful thing about college football and every problem college football has had started in the Ivy Leagues, 1870s, 80s, 90s, and early 20th century. It's astonishing to go back in time and read what essentially could be an NIL scandal in 1901 at Yale with them paying a player and paying for a vacation after he graduated. It's amazing to see how much the same it is. But I will say, out there in the Northeast, in the cradle of college football, man, they have really kind of left the sport behind. It's not a big deal. They don't get big crowds. The marching bands have fallen off. The spirit on Saturday is just, it doesn't mean much to them anymore. And they have truly de-emphasized college football, and it's just a much smaller scale. So I was a little, I guess, disappointed by that. I kind of hope they still cared more about it.
Mark, outside of talking about sports, we love talking food on this show. What were some of your favorite places to eat along the way?
Well, Baton Rouge in Louisiana was good to me.
Great answer.
As it is to everyone. You go out to the West Coast, Southern California, you got the great Mexican food. You go down in I actually, believe it or not, guys, and don't get angry at me for saying this, but I went to Steve Spurrier's restaurant. I spent a morning with Coach Spurrier and had dinner at the place that night, and I got a beautiful piece of fish down at Spurrier's place, which was one of the more memorable meals I had. But up in the Midwest, you get the big piece of steak. Down south, you get the southern fare, the deep fried, the heavy, the delicious, and that's what makes this country so interesting is getting the different stuff in the different places.
Yeah, Mark. Looking back at your excursion, what do you think is the biggest thing you'll take away from that trip?
Great question. How much this country does love college football. How no matter where you go, it's funny. You said you spend time on Twitter. I spent quite a bit of time on Twitter and social media. A lot of times you get the idea that everything's contentious, everything's tense, everything's a battle. Particularly when you talk about college football, I mean the way the Big Ten talks to the SEC and the SEC talks to the Big Ten, and the way everyone disses the Pac-12, and it seems extremely contentious. When you go out, you wear another school's colors, you head into another place. It's amazing how much you're welcomed in. It's amazing how much people want to have a conversation like this, know where you're from, why you're out there, what you've had to eat, what you like best, and all that stuff. So part of the reason I did this is I like the United States as a whole, and I like big American stories. And college football, I always say it's inseparable from American history and culture, and it's still with us in the 21st century. So college football is a great way to experience these United States.
Mark, you've shared your reverence for 90s college football, and I share it with you, and I'll tell you why. Is I've always said on this show, I think you're at your height of your fandom is when you're a teenager. Maybe like going through like 13, 14, 15, kind of before you realize the other girls, and then when you get there's girls out there, and then you realize when you get older, yes, sports are important, but you've got real-life issues to deal with. So I think you're at peak fandom in your early teen years. That's the only thing that matters is what your team does. And it's funny that you mentioned Steve Spurrier because he was giving LSU and the SEC hell in the 90s. And I hated the man, but as I got older, he became one of my favorites. In fact, when we were at SEC Media Days when he was at South Carolina, we were late for something, and we asked the guy in front of us, who'd we miss? He goes, oh, nobody. It was just Spurrier. Almost fought the guy. I was like, how the hell can you just say it's just Spurrier? It's Steve Spurrier, for crying out loud. But also during the 90s, the rival to Spurrier was Bobby Bowden. And, of course, Terry Bowden, as you know, is the coach here in our backyard at ULM. And I've told Terry Bowden this, that I didn't know Bobby Bowden, but outside of the teams in Louisiana, I loved Florida State, and it was just because and I'm sure a lot of it had to do, they were good, but Warwick Dunn came from Baton Rouge, and Bobby Bowden almost felt like he reminded me of my grandfather, so I kind of was drawn to him, and I know you kind of share that reverence for Bobby Bowden like I do.
Yeah, I love Bobby Bowden. He's one of my favorite college football people of all time. Magnificent coach. Obviously, you talk about Steve Spurrier and how good he was. Steve Spurrier is an all-timer. I believe Steve Spurrier never lost more than 2 games to any coach in the country during his entire coaching career, Duke, Florida, South Carolina. Steve Spurrier was 4-7-1 against Bobby Bowden. So Bobby Bowden had the personality, but he was the real deal as a program chieftain, as a leader, as a football mind. He was a brilliant offensive mind. And I love those Florida State teams. I had an uncle who lived in Florida who got into Florida State, and it was actually from watching Bobby Bowden's show on Sundays, and he had a similar reaction. My uncle was a great football player, and he just loved Bobby Bowden, and he got me a mini helmet, a Florida State mini helmet for Christmas, actually, in 1992, and his message on it was 93 Florida State national champs, my pick. And, of course, Florida State won the national title that year, their first. The first year watching college football I can remember was 1991, and of course that was the famous game of the century, Miami at Florida State, the first of several heartbreaking wide right misses that cost Florida State a national title. And part of what I loved about Bobby Bowden is he handled himself so beautifully in some of the most painful losses you could ever experience. Football is such a difficult game. It's so hard to prepare for. The stakes are so high at that level in front of those crowds on TV. And Bobby Bowden, I mean, you just could not get a knife through the heart worse than he got it over and over. And he always had a bigger picture. He always just marched his team into the next battle. Florida State played extremely tough schedules. They had no time to feel sorry for themselves. And I just felt the entire way he carried himself, the way his program played, was extremely appealing to me. And then, of course, they had Osceola with the spear before the game and the tomahawk chop. And as a very young kid, all that stuff, that was all the sound and the fury and the color of college football. And it was just, it was just in my blood. So I love Bobby Bowden.
Mark, let's look ahead. We've talked about the past. Let's look to the future. Do you have a surprise team who could contend for the college football playoff this season?
Man, one of the reasons I love the 90s is because we had a lot more, I won't call it parity. College football never had parity, but we had more teams capable of winning big games and maybe winning a national title. It would have been mythical with a poll vote, but it still would have been more compelling. We're so top-heavy right now. I don't know. Is USC a dark horse contender? I would say USC could maybe get in there, but calling them a kind of a dark horse feels wrong. Florida State, who we just talked about, depending on how they play, I think Florida State probably has a chance. And then, is Texas back? That's the question every year. Is Texas back? They got great talent. I don't know if Sark is a guy who could do it all the way through. He has yet to prove that he can keep it together for a season. But I guess those teams would probably be my outside shots.
All right, now those are your outside shots. You are going to be, as we continue to count down to kickoff, you're actually going to be the first guest we had that we're going to ask for a prediction. As of today, as of June 23rd, and we're going to bring you back on. As of today, what does your Final Four look like?
Oh, boy. By the way, I did not mention LSU. I do have LSU as a dark horse. I think LSU also. Brian Kelly is a sensational football coach. My Final Four, I think Georgia's going to be back. I just think they're a steamroller right now. I think Michigan gets in from the Big Ten. That's 2. God.
Good pick.
Give me Sorry, give me Alabama and give me USC to round it out.
Okay. Well, and I'll tell you the thing about Alabama is they've got more question marks than I think I can remember in quite some time. But Mark, knowing Nick Saban at Alabama all these years, that seems to make them the most dangerous is when they've got questions. You just can never count Saban out.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the questions are serious ones: the quarterback position and some very strange performances over the last few years. So yeah, I totally agree. But as underdogs, it was Saban having something to motivate them with. It's I will not write them off early.
Mark, this was great, buddy. I could have do this all day. I love looking back on college football's past, and I love the journey that you took. And again, I'm jealous. I'd love to be able to do that one day. Before we get you back on again, we're definitely going to do it. Tell our audience how they can follow you online.
Yeah, probably the best spot to hook up is Twitter, fifthdowncfb.com. If you like websites, I got a website at the all right, sorry, I said fifthdowncfb.com. That's the website, fifthdowncfb on Twitter. Find me there. I'm like Deion Sanders. I'm not hard to find.
Appreciate you, buddy. Best of luck.
All right, guys. Appreciate you. Talk again.
You got it. Mark Schipper, everybody. 888-993-7762 is our number. That is the Allstate agent Paul Mims hotline. And text, I'll take a quick timeout. Be back after this.